If you hear bones chiming in the dark, if the forest suddenly goes silent, if you think camping near a cave is harmless, you're already too late. Tonight, you're about to hear 3 of the most disturbing true Appalachian horror stories locals refuse to tell after sundown. These aren't legends. These are warnings passed down in the mountains where the woods are old, patient, and watching. So dim the lights, keep your eyes forward, and whatever you do, don't ignore the rules. If you're drawn to true Appalachian horror, realistic Reddit-style stories, and experiences that feel a little too real, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. New stories are posted regularly, and some of them don't want to be forgotten. Story 1. If you ever find a set of wind chimes in the deep woods that don't sound like metal or wood, don't run, just walk away. And for the love of God, do not touch them. I'm Caleb Miller. I'm 34 years old, and for nearly a decade I worked as a forestry technician in the heart of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I've lived in Appalachia my entire life. I grew up hearing the stories, the ones about the things that live in the hollows, the rules about not looking into the trees at night, and the warnings to never answer a voice that sounds like your mother calling from the dark. I thought I knew the old way well enough to stay safe. I was wrong. I broke the one rule that keeps the peace between us and the things that were here before the mountains were even named. It happened back in late October, 3 years ago. The air was that specific kind of crisp that feels like it's cutting your lungs, and the leaves were so thick on the ground they muffled every step. I was marking timber for a thinning project about 4 miles off the nearest fire road, a place the locals call Dead Man's Throat because of the way the limestone cliffs narrow into a jagged ravine. It's a dead zone. No cell service, no radio contact, and a silence so heavy it feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. I was finishing up for the day when the wind died down completely. Now, in the mountains, total silence is a bad sign. It usually means a predator is nearby. But this wasn't the silence of a cougar or a bear. This was different. The birds stopped, the insects went mute, and the very air seemed to hold its breath. That's when I heard it. Clack, 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 click. It was a dry, hollow sound. It didn't have the musical ring of brass or the soft thud of bamboo. It sounded like rolling dice made of stone. I followed the sound, thinking maybe a hiker had left some gear behind, or worse, that I'd stumbled onto an illegal still. I pushed through a dense thicket of rhododendrons and stopped dead. Hanging from the low-hanging branch of an ancient, gnarled white oak were the chimes. There were dozens of them. They were suspended by what looked like dried deer sinew bleached white by the sun. But they weren't pieces of wood. They were bones, human finger bones, rib fragments, and what looked suspiciously like teeth, all drilled through and strung together in intricate vertical rows. I should have turned around. I should have hiked back to my truck and never looked back. But curiosity is a poison in these mountains. I reached out. I wanted to see if they were real, or if some sick artist was playing a prank. My gloved fingers brushed against a long, curved rib bone. The moment I touched it, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The clacking didn't just happen in the air, I felt it in my teeth. It was a vibration that crawled up my arm and settled in the base of my skull. The bones didn't just sway, they began to thrash, even though there wasn't a breath of wind. Clack, 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 clack. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then the woods spoke. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was the sound of the bones, but they were mimicking my own name. Caleb. It sounded like a rattle in a dry throat. Caleb. You touched the debt. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted. I'm a big guy, and I know those woods like the back of my hand, but I ran like a terrified child. I could hear the clacking behind me. It wasn't coming from the tree anymore. It was moving through the canopy, jumping from branch to branch, keeping pace with me. Every time I leaped over a fallen log or ducked under a branch, I'd hear that dry, skeletal rattle right above my head. I made it to my truck just as the sun dipped below the ridge, plunging the ravine into a bruised purple twilight. I fumbled with my keys, dived inside, and slammed the locks. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles down the road. When I finally got back to my small cabin in Brevard, I thought I was safe. I poured myself a double shot of bourbon and sat in the dark, trying to convince myself that I'd just had a panic attack brought on by isolation. But as the ice melted in my glass, I heard it again. Click-clack. It was coming from my porch. I froze. My cabin is isolated, but I have a high-end security system and a very protective blue-tick coonhound named Jasper. Jasper wasn't barking. He was under the kitchen table, whining, a low, pathetic sound I'd never heard him make before. I grabbed my Remington 870 and crept toward the front door. I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The rocking chair was still. But then I looked up. Hanging from the edge of my gutter, right above the door, was a single string of white finger bones. They were swaying in the still night air. I didn't sleep. I sat in the middle of my living room with the lights blaring and my shotgun across my lap. Around 3000 AM, the whispering started. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from the walls. "You touched the chimes, Caleb. Now you're the string." The voice sounded like my grandmother who had passed away 10 years prior. Then it shifted. It sounded like my ex-wife. Then it sounded like me. It was a perfect, sickening mimicry. It told me things I'd forgotten, shameful things, secrets I'd buried. It told me that the bones in the woods weren't just found. They were harvested. And because I'd touched the debt chimes, I had volunteered to be the next piece of the instrument. The next morning, I drove straight to see a man named Silas. Silas is what we call a sin eater or a mountain doctor, depending on who you ask. He lives in a trailer that's more rust than metal, tucked away in a part of the county that isn't on any map. He didn't even let me finish my story. He looked at my hand, the one I'd used to touch the bones, and his face went pale. My skin was turning a bruised yellowish white, and the texture was becoming hard like a callus, but deeper. "You touched the bone chimes of the hollow men," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "Those aren't just decorations, boy. They're a tether. The things that live in the deep limestone, they don't have bodies like ours. They're made of hunger and echoes. They use those bones to stay anchored to this world. When you touched them, you gave them permission to anchor to you." I asked him how to stop it. I told him I'd do anything. Silas looked at me with pity. There's only two ways out. You either give them someone else to tether to, or you give them what they're asking for. And they're asking for the rest of that hand. I left Silas's place in a daze. I'm not a violent man, and I couldn't lure some innocent hiker to that tree. But the transformation was accelerating. By that evening, I couldn't feel my fingers. They were white, solid. When I tapped them against the kitchen counter, they made a clack sound. That night, the activity in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The clacking was everywhere, under the floorboards, in the attic, behind the drywall. I could see shadows stretching across the floor that didn't belong to any furniture, long, spindly limbs with too many joints. They were waiting for me to fall asleep. They were waiting to take the rest of me. I realized then that the hollow men don't just kill you. They turn you into a part of the woods. You become a sound, a warning, a piece of an instrument that plays when the wind blows through the hollers. I knew what I had to do. I went to my shed and grabbed my wood-splitting axe. I sterilized it the best I could, tied a tourniquet around my forearm, and sat at my kitchen table. I screamed so loud I thought my lungs would burst, but the sound of the axe hitting the wood and the bone was louder. I buried the hand in a box filled with salt and iron shavings, just like Silas told me to do over the phone. The clacking stopped instantly. The whispers vanished. The heavy, oppressive weight that had been following me since Dead Man's throat lifted, leaving me shivering and bleeding on my kitchen floor. I don't work for the Forest Service anymore. I moved to the city as far away from the mountains as I could get. I wear a prosthetic now, and most people just think I had a bad accident with a table saw. I let them think that. But sometimes, when the wind picks up and the city gets quiet at night, I'll hear a faint sound coming from the vent or the window frame. It's a dry, rhythmic tapping. Click, clack, click. And I know they're still out there, in the deep Appalachians, hanging from that white oak tree. They're waiting for the next curious soul to wander off the trail. They're waiting for someone else to reach out and touch the white bones, because the thing about the Bone-Chimes is that they're never finished. There's always room for one more piece. And every time I hear that sound, I look at my remaining hand and I pray that the salt and the iron hold. Because I know the hollow men have a very long memory, and they're still missing a few notes to finish their song. If you're ever hiking in the Blue Ridge or the Smokies and the woods go silent, don't look for the source. Don't follow the music. And if you see something white and beautiful swaying in the trees, keep your hands in your pockets and run until you see the asphalt, because the mountains don't want your soul, they want your sound. Story 2. If you ever find a cave in the Appalachian backwoods that smells like old copper and wet rot, don't just walk away, run, and don't you dare look back. When he did, I'm Caleb Vance, a 34-year-old former seasonal ranger for the National Park Service, currently living in a small, quiet town just outside the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. I've spent the better part of my adult life navigating the dense ancient ridges of the Appalachians. I've seen bears, I've seen cougars that officially don't exist, and I've seen the way the mist crawls over the gaps like a living thing. But 3 years ago, during a solo trek through a remote stretch of the Monongahela National Forest, I learned why the old-timers tell you to never, under any circumstances, pitch a tent within sight of a cave mouth. People don't realize how old these mountains are. They aren't jagged and young like the Rockies. They're rounded, weathered, and hollow. The Appalachians are essentially a massive, crumbling honeycomb of limestone and darkness. When you're out there, miles from the nearest paved road, you start to realize that the ground beneath your boots isn't solid. It's a roof. It was late October, the time of year when the air gets sharp and the sun drops behind the ridges far too early. I was scouting a new trail extension, planning to spend 3 nights in the bush. By the second day, I had pushed deeper into a valley that didn't see much human traffic. Around 4:00 p.m., the sky turned a bruised purple, and a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the woods. No birds, no squirrels, not even the wind through the drying leaves. Just a dead, heavy stillness. I found what looked like the perfect campsite. It was a flat shelf of earth tucked against a limestone bluff, and there, right at the base of the rock wall, was a cave entrance. It wasn't a massive cavern, just a jagged V in the stone about 5 feet high, sloping down into total blackness. As a seasoned hiker, I knew the risks of caves, flash floods, bats, the occasional cranky bear. But the wind was picking up, and that cave mouth offered a natural windbreak. I figured if I stayed 20 feet back from the entrance, I'd be fine. I set up my lightweight tent, started a small, controlled fire, and tried to ignore the feeling of 1,000 eyes watching me from the tree line. The first thing I noticed was the draft. Most caves breathe. As the outside temperature drops, the warm air inside the earth rises and flows out. But this wasn't a gentle thermal shift. It felt like a rhythmic exhalation. Hoo, hoo. It carried a scent that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the damp, earthy smell of a typical cave. It was metallic. It smelled like a butcher shop that had lost power in the middle of July. I ate my dehydrated meal in silence, my headlamp cutting a weak path through the growing dark. Every few minutes I'd find myself glancing at the cave mouth. In the flickering light of my campfire, the shadows inside the entrance seemed to shift. They didn't just move, they seemed to recoil from the light. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 9:30 p.m., telling myself I was just being jumpy. I'm a man of science, a man of maps and gear. But the Appalachians have a way of stripping that logic away from you once the sun goes down. I woke up at 2:14 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch immediately. The silence from earlier had returned, but it was deeper now. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers, casting a dim, hellish light across the campsite. Then I heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from the cave. Slap, drag, slap, drag. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would wake the forest. I reached for my bear spray and my 10mm sidearm, my fingers trembling. I didn't want to turn on my light. I didn't want to see what was making that noise. But the slap drag was getting closer. It was at the mouth of the cave now. I sat up, put my high-lumen tactical light to its brightest setting, and aimed it straight at the entrance. The light hit the limestone, reflecting a blinding white, and for a split second I saw them. 2 eyes. But they weren't like any animal eyes I've ever seen. They didn't reflect green or gold like a deer or a cat. They were a dull, milky white, positioned wide on a head that looked far too thin, far too pale. The creature was hunkered down, its limbs long and multi-jointed, its skin the color of a fish's belly. It looked like a man who had been stretched on a rack and then left to rot in the dark for a century. The moment the light hit it, the thing didn't hiss or growl. It made a sound that haunts me to this day. It mimicked the sound of my own zipper. Zzz-zeep. A perfect, mechanical reproduction of my tent opening. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I scrambled out of my tent, not even bothering with my boots. I had my gun in one hand and my light in the other. I fired a shot into the dirt near the cave mouth, not to kill but to startle. The crack of the 10mm was deafening in the narrow valley. The creature retreated, but it didn't run. It flowed back into the darkness like spilled ink. I didn't stay to see if it had friends. I grabbed my pack, left my tent and most of my gear, and bolted. I ran through the dark, my headlamp dancing wildly off the trees. I could hear things moving in the brush on either side of me. Not one thing. Things. They were keeping pace, staying just out of the beam of my light, communicating in clicks and those horrifying mimicked sounds. I heard the sound of my own whistling, a habit I have when I'm hiking. coming from the shadows 50 yards to my left. I reached my truck at the trailhead just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. I didn't look back until I was 10 miles down the road, shivering in the cab of my Ford, my feet bleeding and shredded from the trek. I went back a week later with 2 other guys, both armed. We found my campsite. The tent hadn't been ripped or shredded by an animal looking for food. It had been neatly, methodically disassembled. The stakes were pulled and lined up in a row. My sleeping bag was gone. We looked into the cave mouth, but none of us had the stomach to go in. The smell of copper was so thick it made us gag. Just inside the entrance, lying on a flat rock, was my sleeping bag. It had been folded, not perfectly, but enough to show intent, and on top of it sat a collection of small, bleached bones. Not deer bones, not squirrel bones. They were finger bones. Dozens of them, arranged in a circle. I quit the Park Service a month later. The thing about the Appalachians is that they are the oldest mountains on Earth. They've seen species rise and fall. They've seen the world change, and in those deep, dark limestone veins, things have survived. Things that have learned to watch us. Things that have learned to sound like us. If you're out there and you see a cave, don't think of it as a shelter. Don't think of it as a curiosity. Think of it as a mouth. Because when you camp near the entrance, you're not just a visitor, you're an invitation. I still hear that zip sound sometimes when I'm falling asleep in my safe locked house in Gatlinburg, and every time I do, I wonder if it's just my imagination, or if something followed me home, waiting for the right moment to mimic the sound of my front door clicking shut. They aren't empty. They've never been empty. Story 3. If you're deep in the Appalachian brush and the crickets suddenly stop their chirping, don't look back. Just run until your lungs burn and your legs give out, because the silence in those mountains isn't an absence of noise, it's a predator holding its breath. I'm Jackson Miller, a 34-year-old former forestry technician. I spent 6 years mapping trails and monitoring timber health in the heart of West Virginia, specifically the deepest pockets of the Monongahela National Forest. People talk about the beauty of the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, but those of us who grew up in the hollows know that the Appalachians are the oldest mountains on Earth. They've seen things crawl out of the mud that humanity has no name for, and they have a way of reminding you that you're nothing more than a guest who has overstayed his welcome. It was late October, about 3 years ago. I was tasked with surveying a remote section of the forest near the Cranberry Wilderness, a place so dense and rugged that GPS signals go to die. The air was crisp, carrying that heavy sweet scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. I had my pack, my marking paint, and my sidearm, which was mostly for the occasional aggressive black bear or a stray coyote. But deep down, every local knows the gun isn't for the animals. It's for the things that don't show up in a biology textbook. I had been hiking for about 4 hours, pushing through thickets of rhododendron that clawed at my sleeves. The sun was starting to dip behind the jagged ridgeline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor. Up until that point, the woods were alive. I could hear the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker somewhere to my left, the constant rustle of squirrels in the dry leaves, and the distant, lonely call of a red-tailed hawk. It was peaceful. It was normal. And then it wasn't. It happened in a heartbeat. 1 second, the forest was a symphony of natural white noise. The next, it was as if someone had hit a celestial mute button. The wind died down. The birds stopped mid-song. Even the sound of my own breathing felt muffled, like I was standing in a room lined with heavy velvet. I stopped dead in my tracks. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing up so hard it actually hurt. Every instinct I had developed over a decade of outdoor work was screaming at me, "Get out, now." But I'm a man of science, or at least I tried to be. I told myself it was just a pressure change, or maybe a large predator, a mountain lion perhaps, was nearby, and the smaller animals were hunkering down. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between the gray trunks of the ancient oaks. Nothing moved, not a leaf, not a twig. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. Jackson. The voice came from the brush about 20 yards ahead of me. It sounded exactly like my sister Sarah, same pitch, same slight southern lilt. But there was a problem. Sarah lived in Charleston 3 hours away, and she hated the woods. She wouldn't be out here in designer boots and a North Face jacket, let alone deep in a restricted survey zone. "Jackson, over here. I'm lost. Help me." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't answer. Rule number 1 of the Appalachians. If you hear someone calling your name in the deep woods and you know they shouldn't be there, you do not acknowledge it. You don't look for them. You don't answer. You keep your eyes on the ground and you move. The voice changed. It didn't sound like Sarah anymore. It sounded like a recording of Sarah, played back at the wrong speed. The syllables were too long, the N at the end of my name buzzing like a cicada. Jackson, help. Me. I gripped the straps of my pack and slowly began to back away. I didn't turn my back on the brush. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where the voice originated. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a bear. Emerging from behind a massive, moss-covered boulder was something that looked like a deer, but everything about it was wrong. Its legs were far too long, ending in hooves that looked like they were made of charred bone. Its neck was elongated, twisting at an angle that should have snapped its spine. But the worst part was the head. It had the face of a buck, but the eyes were set forward like a predator's, large, glassy, and human-like. It didn't walk, it drifted. It moved with a sickening, fluid motion that defied the way muscles and joints are supposed to work, and as it moved, the silence seemed to follow it. The air around it felt distorted, like the heat shimmer off an asphalt road in July. It opened its mouth not like a deer, but unhinging its jaw like a snake, and my sister's voice came out again, but this time it was layered with the sound of a woman screaming and the low guttural growl of a dying dog. "Don't leave me, Jackson." I didn't wait for another word. I've never run like that in my life. I didn't care about the branches whipping across my face or the briars tearing through my pants. I just needed to get back to my truck. Behind me, I could hear it. It wasn't the sound of heavy footsteps. It was a rapid clicking noise. Clack, 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 like dozens of knitting needles hitting the ground at once. It was fast. Faster than anything on four legs has a right to be. The terrain was a blur of brown and gray. I reached a steep ravine and practically slid down the side, the shale slicing into my palms. I scrambled up the other side, my lungs burning, the taste of copper filling my mouth. I dared a glance over my shoulder. It was standing at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the dying orange light of the sunset. It wasn't chasing me anymore, it was just watching. Its long, spindly neck swayed back and forth, and it let out a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a high-pitched metallic screech that sounded like a train breaking on rusted tracks. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. I hit the logging road 5 minutes later. My truck was a beacon of civilization in a world that had suddenly turned prehistoric. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice. I could feel the silence closing in again. The woods around the parking area had gone dead. No crickets, no wind, just that heavy, oppressive weight. I dived into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. I didn't even put on my seatbelt. I cranked the engine, threw it into gear, and floored it, the tires spitting gravel as I tore down the mountain road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 30 miles away in a well-lit town. I sat in the cab for an hour, the neon lights of the open sign, the only thing keeping me from a total breakdown. My palms were shredded, my clothes were ruined, and my mind was fractured. The next day, I handed in my resignation. My boss tried to talk me out of it, told me I was one of the best techs they had. I told him I'd seen a bear that spooked me, but I think he knew. He was an old-timer, born and raised in those hills. He looked at my shaking hands, then looked out toward the mountains on the horizon, and he just nodded. "Some parts of the Monongahela," he said softly. "They don't belong to the Forest Service. They never did. I moved to the coast a month later. I need the sound of the ocean, the constant rhythmic crashing of the waves. I need to know that there's a noise that won't stop, because every time I'm in a quiet room or the wind dies down just a little too much, I find myself looking for the eyes. I find myself listening for a voice that sounds like my sister, calling me back into the dark. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachians and the world goes quiet, if the shadows seem to stretch toward you and the air feels like it's being sucked out of the hollow, don't be a hero. Don't look for the source, just run. Because in those mountains, the silence is the last thing you'll ever hear before you become a part of them. There are things in those woods that were old when the first humans crossed the land bridge. They know our names, they know our voices, and they're very, very patient. The silence isn't a gift, it's an invitation to a dinner where you're the main course. Stay on the trails, stay in the light, and for God's sake, if the woods go silent, run.